Somehow I was in the wrong room.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi. Oh my goodness. Anya's here too. Okay. Yeah. All right.
I just lost my. Hi, Kris. Good to see you.
And we've got.
Aha! I was going to say, good to see your name.
Had to find my button.
So we have Phil and Kaylee. Phil, you made it. It looks like Phil was having. Now I was having difficulty. I don't know.
My student Jana was
the other Zoom room waiting for everybody. Why is everybody so late? Anya said she's going to be here. She's German. She would be here already.
It's still early.
No, but it was like I'm panicking because I've been having a hard time where I go into a Zoom room that I'm supposedly hosting and I'm not the host.
Oh.
And I have to like back out and come back in. So it's just really weird. So yeah.
So how is everything, Kris?
I can't find your CV, Kris, by the way. That doesn't have your updated thing about the heavy metal classics. So.
Oh. Do you need a CV or do you want to wing it or?
But I'll just mention that your most recent, the heavy metal classics.
Okay. I'll be self-promoting anyhow. So, you know,
what are the heavy metal classics? What's this?
Yeah. That's the thing.
It's a book that a friend of mine and I edited about how heavy metal bands use Greco-Roman antiquity.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's kind of cool because that's kind of like a popular notion is that people always think of metal as being so intellectual and also so devoted to like mythologies and things of that sort.
Right.
That's cool.
Right, but at the same time, you have this stereotype of metal being, you know, ignorant and evil, and you know, the people who don't know it. So
right, so. Especially in the 80s and 90s when.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's kind of, I have a long-standing chip on my shoulder in that regard. So that's part of why we did the book. So. It was just reviewed in CR finally. It was exciting.
So what band do you think makes the most use?
Cosa, amore? Amore, sono un seminar. Sì.
Ciao, Ilaria.
Hi.
I don't know if I would say that there's any one particular band that makes sort of the best use, because some of the uses are just so different. I mean, some of the people are so ambitious in terms of trying to do research and everything. So there's a whole concept album about Arminius, Hermann the German, you know, and there's a fair amount of research that went into that one. So I mean, you know, some of this stuff is pretty serious. There's another one by a Swiss band about Caesar's wars in Gaul, but from the Celtic perspective. So that's a pretty powerful approach too.
It would be more metal if he did it from Caesar's perspective.
Oh, there are some of those too. So well, plenty of that.
Oh, we still have 2 minutes before everybody gets here.
That's fine.
Your students, are they just late?
I sent them the link half an hour ago again to make sure that they have it. But Jana said she's sick. She's in bed. She can't. She can't. She caught something. Despite the mask.
Despite the mask. Oh no! Let's hope it's just a regular cold.
Yeah, it's just she's just sick. Something with her stomach, I think.
Hi, Larry. Now see you.
Jackie, am I going to be able to share my screen when it comes time to do?
I'm make sure that you are. Let me just do that right now. I'll make you co-host. I'll make Anya a co-host. Okay, so make co-host. So as people are coming in, I'm going to just start in the beginning. talk about the class. So
Okay, Carla is here, which is a good sign. So
let's see. We lost somebody. Did we lose? Who did we lose? Ah, there we go. Logan.
Anya, are you teaching in person at all this term?
technically I'm on leave, but
Oh.
but then I decided, since we got this chance to cooperate, I thought I'll teach a seminar on ancient Africa. So I'm at the end of the semester now. So
right. I saw that your syllabus was.
Yeah, it's the final weeks for us, so everybody's a bit tired, and so anyway, so it's a good thing to have talks that get people interested and bring them to see the text that we've read in a new light. It's a Latin class. For me, it's a Latin class.
Right. No, I saw your syllabus, but you said the moratum was on your syllabus, huh?
Sorry?
Moratum was on your syllabus?
Yes. Yeah, we had part of it. Yes, we read the description of the African slave.
Okay.
Not the whole thing, but just that part.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we will give
a Roman villa in the region of Cologne. It's an archaeological park, and there's a Roman villa, and they serve there. You can have bread with moritum.
Really? Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, there's can send you some. They also have these herbs, and then they have this spices, a mixture of spices that they call the moritum.
Huh.
They sell there.
Well, see, now I really have a reason to come to Cologne.
You have to.
All right. So why don't I start? And people, I guess, will cycle in.
Yeah. So my two students, the two that are healthy, are here.
Okay. And the one that's sick is not. Looks like most of my people are here. We've got Carrington, Phil, Kaylee, and Maya. I'm not seeing Elisa. I see Logan. Yeah. And Lanina. Okay. I will, in the background, indicate what's happening to the others. Okay, so welcome everyone to our joint session of Classics in Africa, which is the German side from Cologne, and Black Classicism's early W.E.B. Du Bois and the Ancients, which is the Kentucky West side. And I just wanted to go over the website for the students. I'm just gonna, what's most important right now is the joint schedules. So that'll have all of the talks. Everybody can see the website, right? Somebody said, okay. All right, and so here we have the sessions. We are here with Kris, Professor Fletcher. On Tuesday, we're having a joint session that Anya students are welcome to join, though it's not on our regular scheduled programming, which is on Thursday, but we're gonna have Benjamin Howland and Sean Tandy come and talk on white supremacy in the classics in the 19th century, sort of following up on what Professor Fletcher is gonna do today. And it would be good to put them in right after. Then the following Thursday, Professor Bedenvort and Dr. Mumni will be discussing the reception of Carthage, ancient Carthage in North African communities and indigenous North African cities and peoples. Then we will look on our final official joint session is on the 13th. That's a Saturday. The time has now changed till 12:30 as opposed to 2 p.m. Eastern time. I'll change that in the background, mainly because we wanted to make it earlier for the German students. And Professor Matthias Hansas will be talking about Du Bois in Germany and also his attitudes toward Germany as they evolved. And then we'll also have a little bit of a discussion comparing the ways in which Germans dealt with anti-Semitism and the ways in which Americans have not really dealt with anti-Black racism. So, And then the following Tuesday, I'm making this a joint session. I'll be discussing Pauline Hopkins of One Blood and its relationship to Black classicism and also Du Bois. They were contemporaries. And then the Thursday, I will also be discussing the quest for the Silver Fleece as an African-American epic. And then we'll have my colleague, Lenny Ribeiro Leite, who's going to be beaming in from Brazil, where she is kind of stuck right now. But she'll be talking about teaching classics in an African, Brazilian context. So classics in Brazil then and now. That I really encourage everyone to do that. There is the Africana Studies is officially inaugurating the our Commonwealth Black Institute of Black Studies, and we have Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. So he's going to be coming to give that lecture, and that's also open, and it's extra credit for the folks in my class. Then we'll be having Professor or Dean, actually, Patrice Rankin is going to be coming to talk about aspects of Du Bois and Black classicism. He's one of the first people really writing on Black classicism as a classicist. And then we'll have the Du Bois Conference, which will be on March 21st. And then following that will be Emily Greenwood will come and talk about Black classicism and Pan-Africanism. So going right back to Professor Bettenvort's discussion about Senghor. So we'll sort of round that up. And so I'm going to stop sharing now. And for everyone that's here, you're all welcome to attend. You just have to register. Okay, so I think that's allowed us to get as many people in as we could in the meantime. And so now I want to introduce Professor Christopher Fletcher, who is teaching at Louisiana State University. Another longtime friend of Professor Bettenvort and I, going all the way back to graduate school. I think Anya and Kris were at Michigan together when Anya had her Humboldt. And so we're bringing in all our friends, basically. That's what's happening. We all seem to be working on this stuff. So Professor Fletcher has published very recently with another good friend, Osman what do you say? Umran?
Umurhan.
Yeah, Heavy Metal and the Classics, Reception of Classics in the World in Heavy Metal. So he's editor in there. And so today he's going to come and talk to us about Eneas Africanus, Virgil in America, and the Lost Cause. And I've asked him to sort of give a bit of a background on what the Lost Cause is, given that the German students might not be even remotely aware of what that is. And some of my students were not as well informed. So go take it over, Kris.
All right, thank you. Let's see if I can get all the technology to work here. Are you seeing the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right. Step one. All right. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be a part of this, and it's nice to see old friends again. And it's a reminder of the power of connections in life. You never know when you're going to need to call in favors from friends. So, it's good to know. So I just want to introduce myself briefly and talk a little bit about what I work on in order to kind of explain how I got to this and sort of why it's personal in some ways. So my main scholarly interest is in Roman epic and in general on the Roman use of Greek mythology. So I work a fair amount on Virgil and Ovid, and being interested in Virgil and Ovid, it's hard not to get pulled into these issues of reception and sort of how these authors influence people and are reinterpreted and reshaped through the years. So that's in part how I ended up working on heavy metal and how it uses classical antiquity. Some of that is also just being a long-standing fan, but trying to see with what these bands were doing to these things. So on a more personal side, there's also the fact that I'm originally from up north. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. And if you're not familiar, it's up in this little area here. But now I'm down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is very much the South. And, you know, I've been down here now over a decade, but I'm still sort of learning about this very different part of the country. And the vast majority of my students are from down here. So they come from a very different background than I come from. And I found this great map that's got Germany in the middle just to help give the Germans some sort of sense of scale about just the size of what we're talking about. It's a normal map. It's sometimes hard to tell. So I want to do two things today before we discuss this work, Eneas Africanus. And in order to sort of situate our discussion and understand this, I want to talk for a while about Virgil in America leading up to this, sort of the reception of Virgil here. And then I want to talk about the notion of the lost cause and what it is and how it arose and why it's important, not just for this particular work, but for so much of what you'll be talking about this term and really what's happening in the news today. So the first thing I want to stress is that in early America, at the time of its founding and everything, classics is everywhere, that it's a key source, not just for government, but it's a key source for art and literature. So here you see the state seal of Virginia. We notice it has Latin, sort of certain classical stylings to it. This is representative of how ubiquitous classics is in early America and how important it is as a source. Of those, of classics, Virgil is one of the key things. If we look at this, the entrance requirements for Columbia in 1755, you'll see that having read Virgil in Latin is one of the prerequisites. Also, if you're classic students, you might be amused to know that you had to be able to translate the Greek of the New Testament into Latin. So I joke with my students sometimes that I'm one of the few people on campus who could actually have gotten into college in the 18th century in America. All the women, of course, are ineligible because women weren't allowed to college yet. So
my colleague Terry Tungberg is actually teaching Xenophon in Latin right now. So just so you know, we're very,
oh, interesting. One of the Renaissance translations.
Well, yeah. So we're very old school here.
Perfect. So this is Virgil sort of at the core of the canon, and I want to talk about sort of Virgil's different poems and a little bit of how they appeared in early America and building up to this work. So the first of Virgil's poems is the Eclogues, which is this collection of pastoral poems, which is basically shepherds singing songs about how nice it is to be a shepherd, you know, and things like that. And this appeals in early America when America is still very much conceived of as a wilderness, right? Where it's sort of uncharted territory and this Arcadian landscape. But the most famous of the 10 poems of the Eclogues is the fourth Eclogue, the so-called Messianic Eclogue, which is about this child who is born, who's sort of going to usher in a new golden age. And this is one of Virgil's most influential poems, really, ever since he wrote, because it both sets him up sort of as a prophet, but it also allows Christians to accept him in a way, because he becomes sort of a proto-Christian. So, you know, we wouldn't have, here's Dante and Virgil, we wouldn't have Virgil as a character in the Divine Comedy if it weren't for this poem and this notion of Virgil as a prophet and things like this. So Another key, his second poem is the Georgics, which is a didactic poem, meaning it's ostensibly meant to teach you something. In this case, it's meant to teach you farming. And the importance of farming taps into this other key early American issue, which is the role of the farmer. As the country is trying to define itself, there's a big debate already sort of between the North and the South over the role of farming versus mercantilism. And a lot of people in the South, people like Thomas Jefferson, were convinced that the way to have a virtuous, strong country was to rely on the farmers. So now you see this here with George Washington, and people went crazy with the fact that his name was George because, right, Yorgos in Greek means farmer, and so people thought it was perfect. You see here, he's got a plow behind him. This is Washington as the gentleman farmer. This is sort of peak America. This is what he's meant to be as a model, and this ties into the influence or the importance of Cincinnatus, this Republican figure, right, who supposedly is out farming when senators come up to him and say, hey, Cincinnatus, we need you to be dictator to save Rome. And he says, okay, washes his hands, throws on his toga, goes to war. As soon as he's done with war, goes back to farming his farm. So he's kind of this ideal Republican hero, so much so that there was this order of the Cincinnati formed after the Revolutionary War, and it's actually from that order that the city of Cincinnati gets its name. An important city for the German side of things because it is the most German city in America in terms of heritage and things like that. So there you go. It all ties together. Everything's coming together. So, but this is this notion that you are that a citizen should be a farmer first and a soldier second. So this is a later painting, but notice here we've got Washington again is this gentleman farmer, and here sort of part of it is the slave labor that made this kind of gentleman farming possible. But notice how happy everybody looks, right? This is important, right? This is the idyllic, happy life. This is what people wanted this kind of farming to be, and this is how they wanted people to think of it. Now, the Aeneid obviously is the most famous of Virgil's poem, always has been. And this one resonates especially because this epic poem is about colonization and it's about empire. And in the early stages, when the first settlers started coming over, the Aeneid was really a model for this kind of new plan. And they tapped into a lot of this notion of, hey, we've got a divine claim to this land in the West, which is very much like Aeneas being told to leave from Troy, head west, and that there's a land waiting for him. This kind of notion continues really into the 19th century with Manifest Destiny and everything. This notion that it is our destiny as Americans to keep going left and claiming all of this empty land, right? This quote unquote empty land. So Aeneas becomes this key figure, and people like Captain John Smith are likened to Aeneas. Also likened to Jason at one point, Jackie. So this notion of the heroic explorer. Now, you might be familiar with Captain John Smith if you've seen this documentary that is 100% true about Captain John Smith. That's exactly what he was like. I mean, this is really a retelling of the Aeneid, essentially. So the other thing that is attributed to Virgil is this thing that we call the Appendix Virgiliana, the Virgilian appendix. And these are poems that have been attributed to Virgil at various points in time, many of them already in antiquity. Plenty of early authors refer to these as Virgilian. I mean, people like Lucan, Martial, these guys thought some of these poems were Virgil. Nowadays, not many people think they are Virgil, but for most of the past 2,000 years, a lot of people had. The most famous one is this Culex poem, which is kind of a little cute poem about a gnat going down into the underworld. But the one that's relevant to what you're doing is this Moratum, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So one of the easiest ways, though, for us to see Virgil's influence is in some of our nation's symbols, which, as I said, the ancient world is a source. As the new nation is trying to define itself, like new nations always do, you're trying to create a narrative and a vocabulary, right? This is how you create your identity. So we can see how important Virgil is in these early symbols. So this is the Great Seal of the United States. This is the official symbol of the United States. And you'll see right away that we have Latin on here. Now, this Latin comes, it's an adaptation from the Moratum, this part where the plowman is making his lunch, and he's essentially making like a pesto, and he's got all these herbs and things, and he's got some garlic, and he throws and some cheese, and he throws it all together, and it becomes one color. So there's one color out of many. This is where this notion of one out of many comes from, and this is developing it along the same times as this notion of America as the melting pot. So we sort of have the culinary metaphor taken from the Moratum, and then we have the metallurgical metaphor of the melting pot that's sort of arriving simultaneously, both of them about how America is super duper awesome because we take all sorts of different colors and we turn them into one, right? Again, a lot of these symbols and language is aspirational. So just a couple other things to point out, right? The classical symbols here, the olive branch and the arrows, and you'll notice that the eagle faces to the peaceful side, right? So this connotes that the country is ready to go to war, but it would prefer to be at peace if it has to. Pretty much all the stuff, there's 13 stars for the 13 colonies, 13 stripes, 13 leaves, 13 olives, 13 arrows. It's pretty heavy-handed symbolism here. Now, on the reverse of the seal, on the back of it, we also get Virgil. So you'll see there's two phrases of Latin. There's one at the top, one at the bottom, and of course, Roman numerals. This first one comes from the Aeneid, this part where Ascanius, Aeneas' son, prays because he wants to shoot an Italian who said mean things about Trojans. And he prays to Jupiter, and he says, assent to our undertakings, right, is what he says. So this is this assenting to our undertakings here. God has assented to our undertakings. That's, seals like this are always super humble. So the other phrase here, this novus ordo seclorum here, is a modified part from this so-called messianic eclogue, the fourth eclogue, right? This is this thing about the golden age and how we're entering a new period of world history. And this is, one of the things that Virgil is famous for. So we get, these words that are rearranged into a new phrase. But again, these things are coming from Virgil, and this bespeaks the familiarity that people have with these texts, right? And when they want models, they go to the authors they know well and pull out these little nuggets, right? So that's where we get the novus ordo seclorum, and we get a reflection of that medieval spelling in there. That's why there's no AE there. Other symbols, you'll be shocked to know that there's 13 steps on the pyramid. There's 13 little tufts of grass here. All these things that are, hitting us over the head with these things. This eye here is the eye of providence. It's smiling on us. It's, it's associated with God, assenting to the undertakings. Also, the notion of the pyramid, you might notice, or you might remember this idea from Horace's famous Sphragus, right, where he's created a monument more lasting than bronze and higher than the royal position of the pyramids. So the pyramid is the symbol of durability and things like this ever since antiquity. So this is just where we see all of these things baked into these symbols. And these symbols are everywhere in America, right? I mean, on the dollar bill, you get both of them in here. So every dollar bill has 3 quotations from Virgil or pseudo Virgil on there, right? This is how prominent and important Virgil is. Now, these signs are also, unfortunately, throughout the Capitol, as we saw about a month ago. So there's the same Annuit Coeptes. So makes you wonder whether that person knew what he was climbing on. Odds are probably good that he did not. So one other thing about Virgil in America, the 9/11 memorial in New York City, there's a quotation from Book 9. This is from after Nisus and Euryalus die, and Virgil has this apostrophe to them. That was the quotation that's chosen for this memorial. So Virgil, he's not as popular as he used to be, but he's still an author that people go to when they need a snazzy quotation. All right, so I want to pivot now to talk about the lost cause. And to do that, I want to talk first about sort of where America is after the Civil War. And you can see here sort of how America was divided during the Civil War. Now, a lot of these places aren't even states yet. That's why they're still called territories and things like that. As I mentioned before, I'm from up in Ohio. I'm down here now in Louisiana. So this is sort of the area that we're going to be talking about. So after the Civil War, one of the key problems is very much sort of like the problem we're having now in America with this question of what do you do with people who have just committed treason, right? How do you put a country back together when it has been fractured like this? So the initial answer in America is what we call Reconstruction, which in many ways is probably the most misunderstood part of American history. I know when I was in high school and took American history, we definitely didn't spend enough time on it, and it certainly wasn't presented to me in the way that it could or should have been. So Reconstruction in some ways is arguably the period of American history in which America comes closest to fulfilling the ideals of its founding. In the wake of the Civil War, we see this most obviously through the passage of 3 amendments in close succession. And remember that up to now, there had only been 12 amendments, and the first 10 of those, the Bill of Rights, were set in motion basically as soon as the Constitution was signed. So the government, the structure of the Constitution is changing faster now in this period than at any point in its history since its founding. So the 13th gets rid of slavery. The 14th grants citizenship to anybody born in America. And it also says no office for insurrectionists, which may be relevant in the coming years. And then the 15th is the right to vote. Now, the right to vote for all male American citizens, not women. Women don't get the right to vote for 50 years still. So I said it's getting close there. Obviously, it's still not there. But in addition to these legal successes, there are also a lot of cultural successes. Education is through the roof, in part because there's a new proliferation of schools by and for Black people. There's also integrated schools, but so all of a sudden, under slavery, Black people were not allowed to be educated and generally weren't. All of a sudden, though, now there's a ton of schools. So education in America, in some ways, is in a better state during Reconstruction than it is for the next 100 years. So this is part of, and why we don't know this or why we don't talk about this kind of thing more has to do with the lost cause. So there's also increased property ownership here. So there's the development of Black wealth in a way that there hadn't been before. So there's all these great successes, and really, in some ways, the most obvious success is politics, in the sense that during Reconstruction, there are a lot of members of Congress elected who are African American. So this is something, as a kid growing up, I was like, wow, there aren't many Black people in Congress or anything. But there had been sort of this golden age where, because of the fact that Black people could now vote, the Congress was starting to look more like the actual people electing them, right, in terms of percentages. But after Reconstruction, right, this just falls apart. But so you can see the success here of just how different the representation becomes. Now, as you would imagine, these successes make a lot of white people very unhappy. And this is when you start to get the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, right? The KKK, and organizations like the White League. This is when you start to see this domestic terrorism. Here in this image, you can see a burning schoolhouse and lynchings. And here, if you note the thing here, this is a book with an alphabet. So it symbolizes, that these people were trying to learn how to read, right? That they're trying to avail themselves of these opportunities for education. Now, notice the phrase, the lost cause here. I'll talk about what this means in a moment, but it's already in play during Reconstruction. So all of this comes crashing down with what we call the Compromise of 1877. So in 1876, the election, there's a debate between who wins. And the thing to keep in mind is that the Republican and the Democratic parties are essentially flipped now. The Republican Party is more northern, it's more mixed race. The Democratic Party is southern, it's essentially only white. There were several southern states who couldn't agree on the results, with both parties in those states declaring that their candidate had won. So nobody was able to declare a winner in the election. The House wouldn't certify a winner. The compromise that they reached is that the southern states that had been sort of undecided would go for Rutherford B. Hayes, that's this guy over here. But the flip side was that all federal troops had to be taken out of the South. So ever since the Civil War ended in '65, federal troops had stayed in the South to maintain order. Now, as soon as the federal troops leave, all of a sudden new laws come up, right? This is the period of Jim Crow and segregation. And this is when the Southerners, the white Southerners, start trying to turn the country back into the way it had been before the Civil War, right? Voter suppression, this is when voter suppression starts. Here you can see, this is a chart from North Carolina, but you can see how there's a spike here between the ratio between black voters and white voters in a state like North Carolina, and the spike from when black voters began to register. But then as soon as Reconstruction ends, things start dropping precipitously, and then they just get worse and worse and worse as more and more forms of voter suppression are introduced. So Reconstruction, as soon as that ends, things start to get really bad. And this is sort of where the lost cause comes in. So as I mentioned, the term the lost cause had already been used before the end of Reconstruction. But the end of Reconstruction is sort of the first major phase of the development of this philosophy or this narrative of the lost cause, right? As soon as the federal troops leave, there is now this attempt to control the narrative and to essentially declare victory. The other main phase for this is World War I, and this is because all of a sudden you have Northern Americans and Southern Americans fighting together against a foreign enemy, and so there's a mutual focus on the valor of American soldiers and the unity of the country. So people sort of are trying to put the past aside, and the lost cause in some sense allows for a putting of the past aside. At the same time, this is sort of when the Civil War veterans, who are now old men, are starting to die. So there's this question of how do we commemorate these old men? So the lost cause really boils down to two main tenets. The first one is that the Civil War is about states' rights. That is not about slavery. That it's about states' rights. The second is that the South was a harmonious place, and that Black people and white people got along just fine until the North interfered and all the terrors of Reconstruction, right? So these are the two key points of the lost cause. Now, these are propped up by other points that are sort of necessary to believe if you're going to try to advance those causes. So some of these are that Black people are inferior, right? That they're not smart enough to vote. They don't want to be free, you know, because they're like children, they can't protect themselves, right? This is a key part of this. Along those lines is this notion that slaves are happy, right? They're family members, they're well treated. I mean, they're property, sure, but they're expensive property. Why would you mistreat something that you'd spent so much money on? And then on top of that, you know, the Southerners would say, well, see, look, Black people fought on our side during the war, so therefore the Civil War couldn't have been about slavery. And then the reason for the lost cause is this notion that the Southerners were the good guys, right? That they were outnumbered defending their families against the aggressive North, right? There's this aggressive Northern invader, and the agrarian, virtuous South is all they want to do is protect their family, right? And because they're outmanned and outgunned by the wealthy North, this was a lost cause, right? So this is sort of the creating this narrative of the underdog, which is why we call this the lost cause. So these are these key things that prop up these two ideas that the war wasn't about slavery, and that it's the North's fault that there's racial disharmony. So what I think of as sort of the central paradox of the lost cause is really that, hey, we weren't fighting about slavery, but slavery was totally fine anyhow, you know. So not that there's anything wrong with slavery, but we weren't fighting about slavery, right? That's kind of this cognitive dissonance that you have to have in your head for the lost cause. So we see the lost cause stuff everywhere. In classics, one of the places where it pops up is from this guy Gildersleeve, who in many ways is one of the founding fathers of American classics, in part because he goes over to Germany and studies sort of the new sort of scientific methods of classics, and he tries to bring those back to America. So if you know his name now as a Latin student, it's probably because he wrote an English language Latin grammar sort of based on German principles. But he was also the first editor of the, that should be AJP, American Journal of Philology, not Archaeology. But he wrote during the war, he came back from Germany in 1853. He fought for the South. He was from South Carolina. And he wrote a great deal about the war. And we can see the lost cause even in the writings of this well-educated, well-traveled classics professor, right? So here he says that the cause we fought for and our brothers died for was the cause of civil liberty and not the cause of human slavery, is a thesis which we feel ourselves bound to maintain whenever our motives are challenged or misunderstood, if only for our children's sake. So you see some of the self-awareness there, that this is a story that they're telling themselves in part so that they don't look like the bad guys, right? If you say that you're fighting for liberty or for states' rights, that seems noble and virtuous. Whereas if you stand up and say, hey, we're fighting like slavery, which is what all the states did in their articles of secession, they said, hey, this is about slavery, then it's harder to look like a good guy. So this is part of what we see in authors even like Gildersleeve. Another later work where he talks a lot about how the Southern War or the Civil War is kind of like the Peloponnesian War, where the North is like Athens and the South is like Sparta, right? But the way he talks about slavery is so telling, right? True, there was no slavery question in the Peloponnesian War. For antique civilization without slavery is hardly thinkable. But after all, the slavery question belongs ultimately to the sphere of economics, right? Mind-boggling to see something like that. And then we get an out-and-out lie. Virginia, as everyone knows, was on the verge of becoming a free state. I mean, that's just bunk. So we see this lost cause stuff in every aspect of Southern society. And I'll point out that this one is from 1915, just a few years before the Eneas Africanus. So this kind of thinking, this work is contemporary with this novella. Now, in terms of commemorating this, obviously there are the visual symbols and the rewriting of these symbols. And so this is when you start to get this notion that the Confederate flag is about heritage, right? That it's just, this is our virtuous, noble heritage. It's not about the fact that we rebelled, it's about our heritage. We also see in trying to make this permanent and create this narrative. So this is a map from Baton Rouge, the city I live in now, from 5 minutes from me. If you go up this road here, you get to my place. You see here, Confederate Avenue, right here, right by a middle school, which is nice. Shenandoah, Appomattox, General Forrest, a terrible war criminal who fought for the South, gets a street named after him. Vicksburg, another battle. Antietam, another battle. Everywhere this whole neighborhood is just, it's called Shenandoah, but it's all Civil War names. Stonewall Drive for Stonewall Jackson. So when you put these names on a map, right, you are claiming that these are people who are worth celebrating and achievements worth celebrating. But inscribing the land in this way, you're making this permanent. And in this regard, if you've read the Aeneid, you can think about the similarity, right? Notice how everywhere Aeneas and the Trojans go, they add Trojan names to the to the landscape. Now, a lot of the art of the lost cause saw itself as rebutting Northern lies, right? You're trying to control this narrative. And one of the biggest targets was Uncle Tom's Cabin, this famous novel that really played a pivotal role in helping increase anti-slavery sentiment. And a lot of these Southern authors saw themselves as responding to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Perhaps most famously, this author, Thomas Dixon Jr., who wrote a book called The Klansman. And this was the basis for this movie, The Birth of a Nation, which in some ways is one of the first big cinema events, in part because of the scope of the movie and things like this. But this is a movie and a book and then a movie that is really central to creating this notion that Reconstruction was a terrible time, that Black people were out of control. This presents Black men in particular as sexual predators, and the Ku Klux Klan as the noble protectors of white female virtue. This thing, and this was huge, right? It was all over the place, and plenty of critics at the time hailed it as a great movie. It was the first movie shown in the White House, too. Woodrow Wilson was the president at the time, a notorious racist. So there you go. But so this is key to the this development of the lost cause narrative. Now, the most visible symbol of the lost cause are Confederate monuments, and I want to talk about a couple monuments here to get to the Eneas thing, just because they've been so much in the news and they were so important in terms of me trying to or motivating me to finish the article that I wrote about Eneas Africanus, but they're also misunderstood in part because their connection with the lost cause is misunderstood. So when we talk about these monuments, it's a good way to think about how we connect with the past. And it's useful to think about the difference between history and historiography, between what happened and how we write about it. In classics, there's a lot of work done now on what we call reception. And reception sort of reminds us of a related fact, which is that there is no unmediated access to the past, right? I have no unmediated access to Virgil. When I read Virgil, I am influenced by countless texts between me and Virgil. So these monuments can help remind us of this kind of layering, and will show sort of the lost cause at work. So it's also personal because, like I said, when I came down here to the South, I was I've been trying to deal with this and understand and appreciate where my students come from. And 5 minutes from my campus is Magnolia Mound, which is a plantation. So this stuff it's everywhere down here. People still have weddings at plantations, which is super weird, although some of them are, of course, old, beautiful old buildings. So the first one I want to talk about is down in New Orleans, down here. As I said, I'm up here in Baton Rouge. And this is the Battle of Liberty Place monument. And just to give a little bit of background here, at the time, Louisiana is a majority Black state, right? There are more Black people than white people in the state. And Black people were holding a lot of political offices at the time. The Republicans had a lot of political power. The White League was very much against this, and this kind of came to a head in 1874, where the White League rallied a bunch of people down Canal Street, gave a bunch of fiery speeches, and then went and attacked the police and the militia. So certain things sound familiar always. They kick the people out of office and they say, hey, we're in charge now. And then they petition President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who had been the great Civil War general for the Union. They say, hey, recognize us as the officers now, the politicians. And Grant says, not on your life. He sends federal troops. The federal troops kick him out, and everything goes back to normal. But it doesn't ultimately go back to normal, right? This is foreshadowing the end of Reconstruction and what's going to happen as soon as federal troops aren't there to enforce, fairness and the rule of law and things like this. So we see this change over time. So 1874, the event happens. Now in 1882, this is when Reconstruction's over. The Democrats are starting to take control of the offices, in part because there's terrible voter suppression. Now we get to a point shortly after Reconstruction where in Louisiana, as I said, a majority black state, where most counties, parishes, as we call them down here, I don't know if you'd call them a Landkreis up in Germany, but in some of these parishes, only 1 or even 0 black people are registered to vote, right? So it's astonishing disenfranchisement. So white Democrats take over in 1882. They say, hey, remember that place where we met? Let's call that Liberty Place. And you know what? We should put up a monument. In 1891, in the midst of some anti-immigrant fervor, the immigrants were Italian this time, they say, you know what? We should come back to this monument. Let's put up an obelisk. There they build this obelisk. This is the main part of the original monument here. In 1932, when they're even more in control, to mark 50 years, they put this inscription on here. So we're talking 52 years after the monument, more than 50 years since the actual event. So we see this layering, right? United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers. But the national election, November 1876, recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. So you can see how it's framing both the Compromise of 1877, what happened in 1874 with the actual so-called Battle of Liberty Place, right? It's the troops took over the state government, right? Reinstated the usurpers, painting the legitimately elected Republicans as usurpers. So the monument is very telling, right? Again, this monument's from more than 50 years after the fact. And this is during the heart of Jim Crow and all this stuff. So this is all part of this adding to the lost cause. It's only in 74 when that inscription is covered up. But even the 174, this might sound familiar here, in honor of those Americans on both sides of the conflict who died in the Battle of Liberty Place. So there's an attempt here to say this is something we should learn from a conflict of the past that should teach us lessons for the future. But a little bit of the both sides narrative that is uncannily and disturbingly familiar. So that only comes down in 2017, finally, in the wake of Charlottesville and Charleston, where the then mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, says, no, this is enough. Enough is enough. So, but this shows that it's not just simply about remembering history, right? There is a clear narrative here. The other one I want to talk about is up here in Natchitoches, and you'll just have to trust me that that's how that is actually pronounced. And this is this statue that is known both as Uncle Jack and also the Good Darky. So this is put up in 1927. So again, around 1932. Reconstruction's far enough away that white people have completely regained control of the state and are trying to craft this narrative through the monuments that they make, not just the Confederate monuments, not just the generals, but all these other monuments. Now, this is pulled down in 1968 during the Civil Rights Movement. It's from its initial place in Natchitoches, and it's thrown into the river. For whatever reason, it's pulled out of the river, put in storage, and then in 1972, it ends up in Baton Rouge at the LSU Rural Life Museum, 5 minutes away from main campus. So its original dedication here says, right, dedicated to the arduous and faithful services of the good darkies of Louisiana. It's hard to explain how shocking that language is now, I think. A friend of mine suggests in German, Farbiger might be the closest, but I'm not sure if that conveys just how, I don't know. I mean, it's just a crazy term. Now, these names here, there's Uncle Jack. The Jack part comes from the guy who dedicated it, but uncle is sort of this term that is used for a kindly, elderly Black man. You know, sort of a Black man who knows his place, right, and gets along well with whites. And we see this even in products in the supermarket, right, with Uncle Ben's rice and things like this. These kinds of symbols are a byproduct of the same time. And it was only this past summer when both of these brands took these characters off of their products, but they were originally put up in the early 20th century. So, like I said, it comes to LSU, and again, with these plaques, there's an attempt to try to figure out what you do with this and how you spin the thing. So you add this, and this one makes it sound like it's a desirable thing, right? Despite 8 other requests for the piece, including one from the Smithsonian, right? It's a get that we have it here, apparently. So this is a very new, this inscription is only 3 years old, maybe something like that. It's not very old. So constantly trying to come to grips. But if we look at what this is, just notice the positioning, right? This is an act of deference here, right? This is the elderly Black man who knows his place. A statue like this is modeling Black behavior and is setting up whites as the arbiter of Black behavior, right? If your inscription says that this is for the good darkies, right? You're saying, well, we're the ones who get to decide who's good, who's bad. So it's a very, I mean, the gesture tells you everything you need to know. And like I said, we could talk about these monuments everywhere. They're all over the country, not just the South. There's most of them in former Confederate states, but there are plenty of them in non-Confederate states. And again, this is part of the spread and the success of the lost cause. And this is the thing about the lost cause, is that these symbols here ultimately are a declaration of victory, right? They're not so much commemorating the past as they're rewriting it. They're creating a past that never existed. And so the end of Reconstruction, in some sense, means that after all, the South really, in all the important ways, sort of wins the Civil War in terms of what life is like in the South for Black people, and continues to be in a lot of ways. All right, I just want to mention Edwards here briefly. I gave you the little blurb, so you may have seen it. I just want to stress that this is a guy who was very successful. He was well known. Even before the Eneas Africanus, he was the first Southerner inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. This is not some outlier, right? The Eneas Africanus is not some crazy 8chan screed. You know, this is mainstream thing. You know, and he was so prominent that he was able to use his influence to help get a monument funded in Georgia, the state that he's from. This is this infamous Stone Mountain Monument in Georgia, which was originally supposed to take up this whole side, and obviously that didn't work out. But Edwards helped get this commemorative $50 minted, and that some of the proceeds from this $50 were going to go to fund, or did go to fund, the Stone Mountain. And it's, you can kind of make it out, it's a memorial to the valor of the soldier of the South. And again, this focus on the valor, this is part of the lost cause narrative, this idea that they were fighting a losing battle, but they still did it because they were defending their family and their way of life. And their way of life, we mean totally nothing to do with slavery, just their way of life, you know. So here's a close-up of what it is, and it ends up being Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, and then Stonewall Jackson, these three sort of famous super traders here. So the most famous thing he wrote is the Eneas Africanus, which first came out in a newspaper in 1919, then in book form in 1920. Now, it's not published in the North until 1940, but that 20-year gap, as anybody who knows anything about publishing will tell you, you know, if a book is published again 20 years later, that is a sign of high demand. I mean, we should all have our books published 20 years later. And it's so popular that there's a movement to turn it into a musical called the Ulysses Africanus in the 30s. And it never fell through, but it was this crazy idea where the main character would be Ulysses. He would have a wife named Penny. He was going to run away and run a minstrel show. He was going to make a bunch of money, but he was going to come back to the plantation in time to save it from these carpetbaggers. Some of the music was written for it and everything, but it never came through, in part because Paul Robeson was the proposed lead. And he and his agent, who was his wife, said, you know, he's not going to take these Uncle Tom roles because they're bad for society and they're bad for the position of Blacks in America. So it didn't work out. But one last thing about Edwards here, I mentioned this response, this idea that some of this lost cause art is response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in a letter to an admirer in 1937, he said it explicitly, right? I feel that in Eneas we have at last an easy answer to that bloody libel on the South, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that in time the verdict of both North and South will be that truth as to the relations between master and slave is reflected in such stories as Eneas Africanus and not in the imaginings of ignorant people, however good their intentions. So Edwards, in his mind, thinks he's presenting the truth of what slavery was like in this novel, right? And that something like Uncle Tom's Cabin is a lie. So there's a little map there from the states that he covered. You can see Eneas doesn't cover the whole Confederacy, but he is over a goodly portion of it. So I am happy to, I mean, I know we're going to have a discussion now. I don't know if Jackie or Anya, you want to run the discussion. I'm happy to field questions. I don't think we need to.
Yeah, I think that we can have questions. I actually had a question just to ask you if you thought about this, or maybe you have, of course, but the lost cause idea in terms of the appeal to Thermopylae. And
Oh, yeah.
Spartans tend to show up in these, in this. Do you think that that's just my comment? Do you think that that's
yeah, it's definitely a common thing. And so, like I said, Gildersleeve, in his A Southerner in the Peloponnesian War, talks about the South as the Spartans. And again, he's taking those notions of the agrarian, but he's also trying to attract some of the Southern virtue, or the Spartan virtues and stuff. So I don't think he makes the comparison, but plenty of other people do, you know, because again, Thermopylae is the noble stand. It's a lost cause. Like, you know, what could be more manly than to know you're going to lose a fight, but still fight anyhow? And that's what you're doing with the lost cause, right? You're saying, oh, well, we knew we were going to lose because we were, you know, well, they just had more money than we had, you know, but we still fought anyhow because that's how manly we are, right? And that's how much we love our families. So it's of a piece, you know. And I don't think it's a stretch that, or I don't think it's a coincidence, obviously, that a lot of white supremacist groups now love the Molon Labe and Thermopylae and all that stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Kris, for this introduction to the lost cause. I think that was very useful for everyone, especially for those who are not that familiar with American history, but also to see the images and bring these things together. That was really insightful, I think. And I mean, one little detail that I would be interested in when you say that the book Eneas Africanus was reprinted 20 years later, the demand, do we know anything about it? Is that coming only from the South, or like?
So I've had a hard time finding publishing numbers. And the main biography of Edwards was written by his granddaughter. And it is insane because, I mean, it's the kind of biography that you would hope your granddaughter would write about you, I guess. You know what I mean? That it's like he's the greatest ever. And in there, she says that Eneas Africanus, she wrote this in 1967, I think. She says Eneas Africanus has sold over 3 million copies. Now, there's no way on God's green earth that's true, because people have done work and looked at the sales of a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is, you know, sells astonishingly well. I don't even think Uncle Tom's Cabin does 3 million in the same period. So there's no way it's that many. But it also seems like he used to give copies out. You know, he was in all these societies, and when people would join, he would give them a copy. So I mean, it may be that it's like the equivalent of when, you know, Donald Trump Jr. has his book bundled in with admission into, you know, whatever Republican gathering or whatever, right? All authors know that there are ways to drum up your book sales if you really wanted to. But yeah, the fact that it's published by a different press 20 years later, I mean, it must have been selling, you know.
There's a question from Blanche Cook.
Hi, I don't want to jump ahead of any of the students or anyone else, so I can wait. But if there are no other questions, I'll ask my question.
Any questions right away from the students? Jessamine, you have a question?
Yeah, and this is a question for Dr. Fletcher, and also I'd be really interested to know what other people think on this as well. But my question is, I've been reflecting a lot on what, if anything, is the role of classics now. I say with what, if anything, in acknowledgement of the fact that it has been used for lots of mischief, lots of evil, like you've talked to us about. And I'm really curious to know, particularly as a white woman teaching a predominantly historically white field, that is a field limited to white people, how it can be used for good. I say this having wrestled with, you know, fears that I'm perpetuating exactly what I want to be helping to eliminate. And I'd be really interested to know from really, you know, any of your perspectives, how we can use our field for good instead of perpetuating these systems.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I mean, obviously, like you said, it's a complicated thing, and it's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And if you saw the New York Times Sunday magazine the other day, it's very much in the news on a daily basis within the field, essentially. I wish I had a brilliant answer, because I could publish a book that would sell 3 million copies. But I think there are two. I have two answers in a way. The first is that I do still believe that teaching things like Latin and Greek are important and relevant because of the historical perspective that they give us, but also the introduction to these languages and the way of thinking about a language, right? I'm very traditional in how I approach Latin in terms of sort of a grammar and translation approach. I still think that that's a valuable thing for people to do, to read through ancient literature in a very detailed way, in a way that maybe they've never read through any other language. So I think I consider those public goods. I mean, I think that that's still, those can be, those are important and good, I think. But I also think that this is sort of where I think about reception a lot more. This looking at things that aren't classical, or looking at classical things in later periods, because I think reception allows us to do so many different things. Not only does it allow us to sort of indulge our passions, right? When writing about heavy metal, it's in part a personal passion, and it allows me to talk about something I'm interested in, but it's also, I think it's a way of giving our students an angle in, right? So when I teach Eneas Africanus in my class on the reception of Virgil, I have found that a lot of my students, like me, didn't know that much about the lost cause, or didn't really know that much about Reconstruction. And it's a way to bring something like that into classics that, hopefully if it's done well, can be an organic way. So to me, I think that that's part of it, is talking about the long history of classics and how it's used is a way to get at all this. And this is presumably what the rest of this course is going to be like, is that you're sort of trying to say, okay, well, how do you work this stuff into a classics course? Well, if these authors are working on classical texts or dealing with the classical world, then how can you not include it in a classics course? So to me, I think if you're an American in the 21st century and you're trying to figure out what the heck Virgil means, I think the Eneas Africanus is at least a tiny bit of that story. And if you really are interested in Virgil, you should at least look at that. So that would be my answer, but those are far from the only answers. And some people obviously would go much further and in other directions than I would.
Blanche, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. First, I wanted to start off by thanking both Professor Fletcher and Professor Murray for this excellent lecture. I think that this kind of truth-telling...
Professor Bettenfort.
Say that again?
Professor Bettenfort. She's also organizing this.
I'm sorry, Professor Bettenfort. I didn't mean to leave you out. I'm over in the law school, so this is kind of far from me, but I wanted to thank the three of you because I think this kind of truth-telling is particularly necessary in this politically precarious moment. And I wanted to thank the three of you for having the courage to do this kind of truth-telling and to centralize issues like race in areas where we might not look for it, in an area of classics, for example. And also, Professor Murray, I'm just always impressed with your scholarship every time I'm exposed to it. So thank you so very much. When I reference this political precarity, what I'm specifically referencing is this dialectical tension we get into in terms of moving towards social justice and then having retrenchment, right? So we have slavery and then we have Reconstruction. We have Jim Crow and then we have a civil rights movement. We have President Obama and then we have Donald Trump, right? So there's this, and Tea Party. So there's this constant dialectical tension between progress and regression and retrenchment And we're clearly in one of those moments now. And this isn't to throw the GOP under the bus, but the GOP has engaged in an attack on civil rights as a political party platform for the last 50 years. Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, now Donald Trump. And so part of what I'm looking at is the business of the lying, crying, and denying. That is so much a part of power. The lying part, the denying part, the crying part, what Foucault calls the obfuscation element, right? So when I come to these lectures, I'm always amazed at the ways in which we dodge the utter savagery of slavery, the importance and centrality of slavery to the development of this nation, right? It goes from a fledgling nation into a world power in the blink of a historical eye, all through the theft of land and also the harnessing of others' labor. Right, the savagery that was a part of Reconstruction or the aftermath of the Reconstruction, the proliferation of lynchings in the South, and the way that we frame and talk about white supremacy and power. Like suddenly we start using the passive voice. We refuse to sort of isolate exactly what the problem is and who perpetrated the problem. So the lying, crying, and denying is all a part of that. And I'm always amazed at why we do so much lying, why we lie about slavery, why do we lie about these things? There's a professor at UCLA, his name is Viet Wing, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but he says something really insightful, and he says that all wars are fought twice, one on the battlefield and one in memory. And it seems as if the South lost the Civil War per se, but definitely won the war on narrative. And part of winning that narrative, and I really will wrap this up, I'm dealing with what I call this dichotomy that's part of the architectural structure of the mind. And that is the ubiquitous perception of white people as innocent, morally righteous, and in need of coddling, and the equally ubiquitous perception of Black people as dangerous, suspicious, and in need of control and taming. So you saw that up close and personal in the treatment of Black Lives Matters protesters versus the white supremacist insurrectionists on the Capitol. But my argument is that architectural structure in the mind, that dichotomy, actually overrides evidence. It overrides facts, right? So the clear evidence is the savagery of slavery, but we get into this narrative of how wonderful it was. And that is because this architectural structure in the mind pre-exists facts. And it becomes the way in which we filter our reality and all the facts that are out there. Another example is you have a 17-year-old child going to a candy store to get candy and is killed and murdered and blamed for his own death. I'm speaking specifically about Trayvon Martin. But my question is, would you agree, do you have any remarks about this dichotomy? And again, it's whiteness perceived as innocence, morally righteous, and in need of coddling, versus Black people perceived as dangerous, suspicious, and in need of being controlled. And it becomes a perceptive lens that exists before the facts, such that when you're ever presented with facts, like slavery, like Reconstruction, like the proliferation of lynching, it gets filtered through that dichotomy in ways that directly contradicts the facts that are out there. And aren't we in a historical moment where that kind of dichotomy overrides facts at all, right? That kind of narrative that gets produced is very, very different from the facts that we actually see. So that's my question.
Right. And I mean, I think you touched on a lot of really important things there. And this notion of, this dichotomy overriding fact, I mean, that's, you're getting at the heart of myth making. Whatever, and people sometimes call the lost cause a myth. I think that, and this is not to excuse it, but, this is human nature where nobody wants to go around and think of themselves as the bad guy, right? And so people are trying to come up with a justification for these things. So, you know, in some of Gildersleeve's writing, for instance, the classics professor I mentioned, you know, you see this thing that is in a lot of lost cause writing, which is, again, that Black people need to be in control. You know, Robert E. Lee in his writings said that white people suffered more from slavery than Black people because it was something that was bad to do, and so it was a moral taint for white people to do it, but that ultimately in the long run it was good because it was civilizing Black people, right? So this is this turning things into a narrative where you say, you know, especially early on when so many of the slaves are fresh off the boat as it is, where you can sort of say, well, we have these savages, right? They're not Christian. They don't know what civilization is. So we have to do this. So I think that narrative, I don't think you can engage in those practices unless you tell yourself something like that from day one, basically. You know, you have to kind of come up with some way that allows you to sleep at night. And that's why so many of these myths take hold. And it's not just, you know, a myth like this. Think about Holocaust deniers. You know, it's a similar notion where you can say, no, this didn't really happen. There's no way that people could be this evil or something, you know, or there's no way that my grandpa could have been involved in something like this or whatever, or there's no way that my country could have let something like this go on for so long. So I think that's I mean, exactly what you're talking about is that power of myth. And that's part of why the lost cause won out, not just in the South, but in the North. You know, I think that the North is just as complicit in the lost cause as the South, because if the North had said all along, like, no, all of this is crap, you know, and called the people out on this stuff, I think things would have been very different. But like I said, especially after World War I, people are trying to find unity, and you don't want to look at your fellow citizens and think, oh, these people are evil or terrible people or something. And so, you know, if somebody wraps up a nice narrative in a bow tie and presents it to you, you say, you know what, that is great. I think I will believe in that. So I mean, I think that's how I would respond to that.
So just really quickly, thank you so much for that response, because I think that was just deeply insightful about the political moment we're in right now. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Anya.
Yes, this kind of takes up the question from Jessamine, but also what Blanche just said. I mean, what can classics do, and what are we going to do when we have this tension between, you know, going back and forth between the extremes? I think in my experience, I've been working with North Africans for a while now on the reception of antiquity. In my experience, for those people who want to bridge the gap between these extremes, classics can be helpful because it's kind of remote, right? You can discuss topics that are relevant to you by taking a period of time that's kind of remote, but at the same time, it's still familiar, right? And if you have two people who really want to engage in this discussion, classics can help because you're discussing a topic and not triggering all kinds of other topics at the same time, right? For example, when we work with North Africans, like with Muslims who are receiving the history of St. Augustine, we're going to talk about this in the next session a bit. Of course, for them, it's a tension, right? Being a Muslim and talking about a church father, it can be problematic, right? And the way they find out of this, because they're interested in the history of their own country. St. Augustine is a North African, so they're interested in their country. They are Muslims, but they're not radicals, right? So they want to get away from this radical ISIS kind of Islam. And what they do is they take classics, like the historical period of antiquity, because it's pre-Islamic and it's pre-Christian, and you can discuss topics of liberty, of exchange, of intercultural connections that were there in antiquity without triggering all kinds of modern problems as well, right? If you did the same thing, if you would get together with Europeans or Americans or with other liberal Muslims and start to discuss this whole thing, how you relate to other groups that are different from you and that are not in this radical strain, you can come up with a whole chain of problems, and classics might serve as a buffer if you have somebody who really wants it. You know, if you have somebody who just doesn't want to hear facts or is afraid of bad things that you might hear in the course of the discussion, then it's a problem. But if you have somebody who wants it, it can help. And some of you might know this, that the Pentagon actually had a program for veterans. I think it was from Iraq, from the first Iraq war, where they showed the Philoctetes to American veterans to help them get counseling. Because for veterans, obviously, it's not the first thing you do, right? You're a soldier, you're not coming back traumatized from a war and say, I need therapy. So what they did is they showed the Philoctetes to them, the tragedy where the hero Philoctetes is bitten by a snake, and then he has this wound in his foot that won't go away. And so they finally leave him on an island all by himself. And so you have this tragedy of the hero, the wounded hero, who's not longer part of the big heroic story. And the Pentagon used classics to get soldiers to seek help, because they could discuss their problems not as their problems, but as Philoctetes' problems, which in a way mirror their own, right? And this is, I think this is a technique that if you know classics well, if you know antique ancient literature well, you can use it to discuss problems that are too hard and too painful to discuss in another way. And that might also work with the racism, the problem of racism, right? Could be.
No, I agree. And I mean, that's, you know, working a text like Aeneas into a class on the reception of Virgil is a way to get at some of that, right? Is to say, okay, let's come at it from the classics angle and see what we can do with it when we do it that way. And I think that's when reception is at its best, is when it sort of allows us to do something like that. But no, I've often felt, you know, that, you know, I used to think a lot that classics was less problematic because it wasn't anybody's patrimony. But that's not true, obviously. You know, there are plenty of Italians and Greeks who claim it as their patrimony, and understandably so in a way. This comes up a lot with Greek and Italian heavy metal bands, right? And so, but then there are also a lot of people, you know, who will say, well, no, it's not really my patrimony. You know, it's not, you know, I think part of Professor Padilla's piece in the Sunday magazine the other day was that it was something that wasn't really part of his patrimony, you know, and that's part of where these conflicts arise. So, I mean, I agree with you that the distance in time at least gives us it gives us a perspective and a certain buffer that is harder to have when you're looking at something contemporary. But the notion that it's nobody's patrimony, that's something that is a little bit more problematic, you know, and something that I grapple with too.
Especially when it's claimed,
right?
Claimed by some, in especially in the States, it's claimed as, you know, white patrimony, and then denied to Black, and also rejected by Black as not. So yeah, but nonetheless, it's a good way to think. I do think that you know, that the idea, first of all, getting to know that, okay, if I want to teach classics, and recognizing that, okay, it has all this very complicated history, complicated use, at least you're you know, being aware of you know, the sort of implications and the uses of it will make it a little bit more careful. Like, I'm sure, Kris, you're very careful about how you're representing classics, because you know full well that it's being weaponized to radicalize white supremacists in the dorm room, right around the
Right.
right. So if we're not aware, I think then it becomes problematic. Certainly for me, it's easy because if I'm teaching classics, race is on the table. It's just straight up. It's just on the table. Whereas for Kris or for Anya, they might not necessarily come up or seem to be relevant, right? When it turns out it is actually very relevant because of, it's not isolated to the outside world and the world of the cafe or the dorm room or whatever, right? So yeah, but I think I think you did a really good job, Kris, in explaining for everybody the lost cause, which some people may not have ever heard of, and I'm sure now they're fully fully informed, especially the role that classics was played in terms of how it was weaponized to perpetuate the lost cause. And so at least it makes us much more cognizant of when we're working with classics that we have to think about, okay, also there's this echoing that it's making that you might not be hearing yourself, but other people might be. So I want to thank everyone for coming. Class does end at 3:15. However, that's why some of the students had to drop out.
Oh, okay.
But no, it's okay to go on because I'm recording it, and then the students who had to leave.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to stick around for a while too if people have questions. Or
so if anyone has any more questions, we can continue on.
Okay.
Let's have someone who hasn't asked. Anyone else has a question? Okay. All right. Jessamine, you got another question?
Yeah, I am that person. Sorry. Sorry, not sorry. So my question is a pretty technical question. It's, but you mentioned the election of 1877, which is something I'd heard references to quite a bit within the last few months, but never really understood. And I was hoping you could explain why, like, what was the source of the dispute over whether election results could be certified, and why was this the case for so many, for apparently so many states?
Mm-hmm. So now, first of all, I should say that I'm a classicist first, and all the rest of this stuff second. So, well, heavy metal fan first, then classic second, and stuff. So, but and this is the danger of dealing with reception, is that all of a sudden you have to master all sorts of material. So, first of all, I don't want to put myself up as an expert in 19th century politics, because I am not. But so it's the election of 1876, right? The compromise is in 1877, just like if we think 2020, the election, but then 2021, the certification and all of that stuff. What happened was it was South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana that weren't certifying, I believe, are the three that aren't certifying. And a lot of it comes down to, in some ways, the same stuff we have problems with now, which is just ballot counting, right? Where it's saying, well, no, these votes don't count, or these votes count, or these votes are fake, or whatever, or these votes weren't in on time. So it's a lot of the same kinds of things, and all of this is compounded by the fact that there's just not technology in place, right? Any kind of communication is much slower, even when you're dealing with, the rudimentary technology that there is, but it's harder to keep track of this and share numbers and communicate with people in any kind of sustained way. But it's very much what's happening now, where because so much is at stake, people aren't willing to back down. And people in the state on the electoral boards, or the people who are in charge of the election within the state, wouldn't agree. They would just say, no, like, we're not going to go forward. We're not going to announce our results. You've got one side claiming victory, the other side claims victory. I mean, in some ways, it's as simple as that. I mean, we've all seen what happens when one person just straight up lies repeatedly about the results of something. The people who want that lie to be true are happy to go along with it and happy to amplify it. Some people have made an argument that this was a part of a larger sustained ploy by some of the states to force just something like this. I don't know enough about that to know how plausible that is, but that's really, so on the state level, you have people who don't want to certify the results in the state, but then the House also doesn't want to certify because plenty of people in the South didn't want to have a Republican president. So, I mean, you know, when you know some of this stuff, watching what's happening now is just like, oh man, I thought, you know, couldn't we have dealt with this 150 years ago? Like, what the hell's happening here? It's so depressing. But I mean, there are all sorts of great books about the Compromise of 1877 if you're interested, and obviously so many about the lost cause, and there have been so many of them from the last few years as all of this stuff has kind of come back to the fore.
Any last questions? Oh, I think we got a question, Christina.
Really a question, just more of a comment, sorry. Dr. Fletcher, you mentioned Dixon. I actually lived for 6 years in the city that Dixon is from. We have a street named after him. We have a Confederate statue on the courthouse stairs. The lost cause is deeply entrenched, especially in that region of Appalachia, especially. And it's so hard to talk to these people about the fact that it's a myth because, right, they don't want to see themselves as the bad guys, especially since a lot of them didn't own slaves directly, at least, and where they don't see themselves as, you know, that's, you know, my great-great-grandfather didn't own slaves, right. So they weren't fighting for that. It's such a hard thing, and I appreciate you talking about this, but I saw that comment, I was like, oh yeah, I remember going to the protests last year and having to try to have these discussions with my colleagues. It was a great time, but yeah, I don't know how it's such, and there's also the issue that, especially in secondary teaching, I taught high school for 6 years in the South, in North Carolina, and in that town, which was, again, very interesting sometimes. And it's also an issue of, it's in the curricula now. The lost cause is now a part of the curriculum in a lot of Southern states. And I just also wanted to say that in case that was something that some of our people didn't know, that it's a part of the curriculum for a lot of states.
Right. Now, that's an important point, is that you could, you know, if you look at textbooks through the years, you know, they have pushed the lost cause, you know, and this is where, you know, politics and money and all this stuff is inseparable because, you know, I don't know how much any of you know about how textbooks work, but a lot of time textbooks cater to states like Texas and California, just because of the size of the population. And so you say, well, nobody's going to cater to Louisiana, right, for an American history textbook because it's so small relative. Nobody's writing an American history textbook for Vermont. But Texas is huge, so let's write it for Texas. And so we have to write something that matches the education requirements or standards in Texas, and then those are voted on by Texas. So you have politics creating knowledge. But I mean, not to sound defeatist or entirely cynical, but I mean, this is true everywhere, right? This is sort of, you know, politics and knowledge obviously are inseparable. The people in power control knowledge. That's just how it works. This is part of why politics is so important. And trying to wrest as much of that power away as possible. But yeah, no, I mean, it's all the textbooks. I mean, even in the North, in the textbooks I remember using, you know, there's a lot of the stuff about the nobility of the South and the valor of the South and things like that. And I think, again, some of that is just people trying to be nice and move past things. You know what I mean? Like, not all of this is done maliciously, right? Even if the end results are negative, some of it is done because people, people don't want to make waves, right? Everybody's got a friend group where there's somebody that everybody hates in the friend group, but like you still invite that person because nobody wants to make waves. I mean, this is human nature, so it's like, well, okay, yeah, you guys in the South, you were really jerks back then, but like that was back then. So let's try to move past. I mean, some of it is human nature, in all its good and bad ways,
Well, I think also, at least for my part of the class where we're going to be looking at Du Bois, you can start to get a sense of why for him education was extremely important, right? And having an education for Black people that actually tried to combat this stuff, because this stuff is coming out exactly, these dates that Kris is pointing out are contemporary with his own writings, with Souls of Black Folks, which we're going to look at, with Quest for the Silver Fleece, which we're going to look at. They're all coming out around the exact same time, where he's trying to talk about what education for Black people should look like, whether it should be capitulating to the demands of the white supremacist universe, or whether they should have more useful or helpful education. But I think also this point that you're mentioning about the lost cause in the textbooks, when we're talking about racism, we're talking about systematic structures, right? And of course, one of the biggest sort of columns within a systematic structure is going to be education, just like church, laws, education. So yeah, and so if we have the education system captured, as it has been since the beginning, right, by this in the white supremacist assumptions and narratives, right? Because you're mentioning, Kris, about how, well, some people just want to get along, but it's often at the expense of the Black people who are going to be the victims of the white supremacy that is perpetuated by white people getting along. Like, so white people in the North and white people in the South, oh, we'll all get along, but then the Black people are still being lynched and still being executed by the police. These kinds of things start to happen because nobody's got the courage to say, no, we're not gonna have this on the levels where the power is, right? So yeah, all right. So I think Blanche has a question, and then Anya will wrap it up.
Just really quickly, a quick comment, and that is, I should reveal, I'm a law school professor, so my background is in the law. Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy and was also the lead, well, he wasn't the lead in the movie Just Mercy, but the movie Just Mercy was based on him. In any case, he is a law professor at NYU, and he also runs an innocence project in Alabama called the Equal Justice Initiative. But in any case, he makes the argument that one of the problems with the United States is we've never had a truth and reconciliation process for the period of slavery and also post-Reconstruction and Jim Crow, that we've never rigorously dealt with the treachery and the savagery in the same way that Germany dealt with the treachery and savagery of the Holocaust, right? So it's unimaginable for any German citizen to say, let's make Nazi Germany great again, right? This longing and nostalgia for treachery and savagery just does not happen there, because the country has done a better job of dealing with a very difficult point in history, but it's got to be dealt with. So as Martin Luther King writes in the letter from the Birmingham jail, you've got to take a festering boil and expose it to the antiseptic power of the sun and light in order to deal with it. So part of our educational system, our epistemological systems, lectures like this, the work, Professor Fletcher, that you're doing in this, your work, Professor Murray, is dealing with the rigors of truth-telling and honesty, so we have a better understanding of exactly what the past was and why we're here at this moment. So that's my
I'd be curious actually what some of the German students would actually think about that, because my impression is that it's not as neat and clean in Germany as that. Maybe they've made more progress than we have in that regard, but not completely.
I'd love to answer this because it's exactly what I thought. It's that we have this party here, the AfD. It's the alternative for Germany. What is so different to make America great again? So we have this party here, and we have a lot of people re-believing in these narratives we had just about 100 years ago, and so it's there. Of course, you can't say, "Oh, the Jews, we don't want them, and we have to kill all of them." Of course, you can't say this, but the tendency is there. And so you had this education and you know these things, but there's kind of flashback. It's a bit like in the US. I think this problem with these regressive forces, or how you want to call it, is not only in the US, but it's also in Europe. You can see it in Germany, in Ungarn, I don't know, how do you pronounce it in English?
Hungary.
Hungary, thank you, yeah. And so you can see it everywhere. And I wonder also in now in the talk, in how far this narrative of the lost cause is not only going or taking further the civil war, but not with weapons, but with like in a not weapon style. So yeah, that's
right.
it.
Well, first of all, thank you for asking or giving your answer in English, and thank you for listening to my talk in English, because nobody wants to hear me speak German. But I mean, I think that's 100% right. The lost cause, really, the success of the lost cause, I think, shows that the South in some ways won the Civil War in a lot of meaningful ways, in terms of keeping life the way they wanted it. Obviously not completely, but a lot of that. But I think that's, this is something that Blanche had mentioned about, this famous notion that every war is fought twice. And if we think of the social war in Italy, right, in first century Rome, it's a similar idea where, you're trying to move past these wars against allies. And then with the civil wars, actual civil wars, not only are you trying to say, well, who won and what that means to win, but then how to present that. I mean, it's clearer with Antony and Octavian with the ways of how you declare victory, but even with the social wars, how you talk about who came out on top. So Rome claims victory in the social war, right? That everything's great, but really the Italian allies got most of what they wanted. So it's how you declare victory is just as important as what actually happens. But no, there's a lot of German metal that has very far right-wing things. So I know it's not that everything is not puppy dogs and rainbows in Germany.
Maria, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just also wanted to say that it's not so nice here also at the moment. But I would be interested in if in the US is the concept of white fragility, is it also in the mainstream that people get to know more and more about it? Or is this?
My impression would be no, that I think academics know it, but I think if I went down my street and asked people if they knew what white fragility meant, I don't think they would know that. I'm not sure even most of my students would know if I asked them.
Okay, thank you.
But that's just my impression. I don't know if other Americans.
I would definitely agree with that. I think if I had brought that up in the school I taught in for the last 6 years, I would be thoroughly told off that how dare you say that. You know, I'm not fragile, right? I have a Black friend. What do you mean I don't react well to this type of stuff? I'm like, oh my gosh. But yeah, I definitely agree with that. And especially even to students who parrot the things their parents say. It's even, you know, then you get emails saying you're indoctrinating my kids. So I think definitely among certain academics, you have people who understand this and are working with and trying to understand and relearn and do better. But there are definitely, I would say, my experience in parts of the South, which was again rural Appalachian parts of the South, it's very much you don't talk about it. You just kind of you play nice, you make nice with people.
I'd say everyone thinks they understand what it means, even if their reaction to the term white fragility is a knee-jerk reaction like Christina describes. So the term, there are people who believe in it and are working to understand what it means. There are people who push back against it, and there's probably as many reactions to it as there are people who hear it more or less knowledgeably about what it's actually referring to. So I've definitely heard a lot of pushback. I've also heard, you know, a lot of people trying to unpack it and figure out what it actually means for them. So, but I definitely would say there's a lot of pushback.
And I'd also comment that obviously it's not a monolith. Even at my rural Appalachian school, there was a small conclave of us that would be like, hey, did you hear what so-and-so like did in their class? I can't believe they can do that. So I don't want to present it as we don't want to present any group as a monolith. But again, there are certain people, especially those who are more left-leaning, who embrace these ideas, wrestle with these ideas in parts of the rural South, but it's not necessarily a mainstream idea.
Anya, you had one.
Yes, maybe we were coming up with this topic again in the last session of the seminar with Matthias Hanses also. But one thing that came to my mind during the discussion was that we did have basically the same way of reasoning as the lost cause after the First World War, right? When the myth in Germany was that Germany didn't lose the First World War, it was just that politics just stabbed the army in the back, you know, that the army was valiant and they would have been able to win the First World War had not politics stabbed it in the back. And that created a mistrust in the new democracy that arose after the First World War, and that in turn helped to trigger, you know, the Nazism, the rise of Nazism. So there is a danger in this myth of the lost cause or the dagger in the back. That's what it was called in Germany, right? And the dagger in the back of the army. So that's very dangerous. And as far as the re-education, I might say, after the Second World War goes with the anti-Semitism, I think one of the most successful things was to create empathy. Basically what you said about Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? The way of creating empathy for the victims of the persecution and of the Holocaust. And the first time that when I was a child, when the series aired on TV, but the American Holocaust series, some of you may know this, so I think six appointments of this series. That was the point in time when there was a public discussion in Germany for the first time, and that must have been at the beginning of the 80s, I think, right? Because I remember as a child, that was the first time that I heard the word Holocaust, and I asked my parents, what does it mean? Because heard it because everybody talked about the series, and the series was from the viewpoint of a Jewish family, and so this family who was murdered basically at the end. And the interesting part when I thought about it when I grew up was that Jewish family was a German Jewish bourgeois family, right? Could have been yourself. It was not a Polish Jewish family, for example, right? Who had much more Polish Jews were murdered, but they took a family was like you, kind of, to create empathy. And I think this is something that worked. Also that they brought Holocaust survivors who had agreed to come to Germany and brought them in to talk to students, right? And it was a weird situation. Unlike in the US, there weren't hardly any Jews left in Germany, right? I can say for my part, before I went to America, I knew one Jewish family by chance, right, in my university town, one family that was Jewish that were friends of mine, and nobody else. All the other Jews I've ever met were at memorial services, right, or survivors who came in specifically for the purpose. So that's kind of a weird artificial situation also. It's the best you can do, but it's, the only way you can find to create empathy. And I think this is the only thing that really works, because that overrules kind of even the myth, right? The moment you start to see the other person could be yourself or is not unlike yourself, that really helps.
Blanche, you have your hand up. Do you have another comment, or is it just that you?
It's going to be really brief because, for one, I'm not a part of this class, and two, I have another appointment at 4 o'clock. But I wanted to make some really brief points, and they are, I don't think that we've seen the kind of white supremacist nationalism around both sides of the Atlantic since the end of World War II. So we're seeing this in Brexit, we're seeing this in Hungary, we're seeing this in France, we're seeing this in Germany. So I don't ever want to suggest that any country is some sort of paragon of racial justice, because once you find that country, trust me, I will pack up tenure and everything else, including this house, and move within a nanosecond. So when you find that place anywhere on the globe, please, my email address is on the web, email me right away. I will get out of here in 5 minutes, okay? So I didn't mean to suggest at all that this place exists. I still maintain, however, that I do think that German society overall, and including surviving Jews, and perhaps even globally, have done a better job at truth and reconciliation when it comes to the Holocaust than the United States has ever done with respect to slavery. So peace and good tidings to everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. Again, tremendous kudos to Professors Bittenworth, Fletcher, and Murray. This is just outstanding. This is more riveting. Well, I shouldn't say this, but this has been by far more riveting than any conversation I've been involved in the law school this year. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I wish you all very, very well, and your students as well.
Thank you very much for joining us, and you can join the next ones as well. So everyone is always welcome to the next ones. Just make sure you register. All right. So shall we end and thank Professor Fletcher for joining us. As I said, this will be recorded, so if you had to leave, the students who had to leave, don't worry, you didn't miss a thing. You just can't respond. And I want to thank you so much, Kris. It was a fantastic expose of classics and the lost cause especially. I think you did a really good job in showing how important Virgil is into the foundation of and how Americans conceive of themselves in relation to the classics, and how that can't be really separated from the issues of race and politics and identity, etc. So thanks.
Right. Well, thank you all, and thank you for having me. It's good to see you two again, even if only virtually. So
yeah, thank you, Kris, a lot. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Ilaria, for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you for advertising. I saw it on Facebook. Thank you so much for advertising this. This is
yes.
absolutely useful in an attempt to understand and to really become a better teacher for our students. Thank you so much.
Well, please, you're welcome to come to the next ones as well. So
thank you so much.
Okay.
All
Next
right.
week, same time, same place.
Yes, next, yeah. Well, actually Tuesday, same time, same place.
For you it's Tuesday. Okay, for us.
If you're a student, the German students have free time at the same time on Tuesday. We have a continuation of this discussion with two colleagues who are working on focusing on the KKK and their use of classics specifically, but also how this plays into the racial terrorism that happened around the time. And this is really important for my class on Du Bois, because this is exactly the time that we're focusing on of his life, which is the early part, which bridges right into all of this. So yeah, so it'll be great. So thank you very much.
Okay.
All right.
Good afternoon and good night.
All right. So Kris, that was great. Oh my God, that was so awesome.
That was really awesome. It was easy to understand and